Good afternoon. Welcome back to our Old Testament study for the second year. We will continue this year by studying kings and prophets and setting the stage for a new kingdom or nation of Israel. Our fall classes are September 5th today, and 12th, 19th, and 26th. So four Thursday evenings this month, and next month four also. And then we will be into the month of November. Only three sessions. We'll take a holiday break from Thanksgiving through the new year, and then we'll be back. So today I thought that we would do a little bit of review from last year, since our first time tonight or today that we're getting together, since 3 months have gone past. Maybe we could use a little bit of just a highlighting of each thing that we studied. Not anything in depth, just to give our memories a little bit of a jolt for where have we been, what have we studied, and then where are we going to continue on to. So I have this Old Testament timeline. It's a little bit hard to read, I realize, but look at this picture of this timeline and consider this the complete Old Testament in our Bibles. So we have started in Genesis last fall, a year ago, and we've gone all the way from Genesis all the way up to this green line was all Genesis. We met the patriarchs, we studied about the flood, and many other interesting characters and events along the way. At the end of Genesis, we moved into Egypt, from Mesopotamia into Egypt, and from there we started the book of Exodus, and we moved all the way through Exodus and around, and we're all the way to Exodus till right here, this line. And after that, we are in the book of Joshua, and this was the great conquests. And then we had Judges, the Judges of Israel, and this was where we left off last year, or this spring. So you can see we covered a lot of material in our first adventure through this Old Testament study. So this time we are going to study kings of Israel. So we're going to study kings and prophets, because the prophets spoke to the kings. So we'll start out with this fall, and we'll see how far we get this year. In Genesis, we learned about God, the God of creation, and that Genesis also contained the stories of the origins of the people of Israel. In Genesis, humans were created in God's image and are spiritual beings that are made to be able to relate to God. They are given responsibilities to care for the planet and all the species on it. And we found out that Yahweh is relational, and he desires to have balance in the world. So a little bit of fun with Genesis. We had a lot of creation jokes and so on throughout the time, but this was one I didn't show last year, but I still thought it was kind of funny, and here it is. And I think that God looks a little bit like Santa Claus here with his red suit and white beard. In Genesis also, Yahweh of the patriarchal fathers of Israel was viewed as an active participant in life. He walked and talked through messengers with the Old Testament patriarchs, and he was included in everything in daily life, and he was also seen as a warrior god. The God of Israel is a God of covenants. The covenants are God's means of delivering promises and blessings. God made covenants with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and with Israel as a whole nation. In Exodus, we moved into a new theme of liberation and law. The covenants that were in Genesis have evolved into a set of laws bound by faith. The God of Exodus is a God of liberation from tyranny and making a spiritual presence among his wandering people. So an interesting thing is, if you are into the movies at all, you'll oftentimes see movies of the Hebrews in Egypt, and they'll show them always laboring on building the tombs of the pharaohs, which is a complete fallacy. The tombs of the pharaohs were already built and quite ancient by the time that the Hebrews were spending their 400 or so years in Egypt. Instead, what the enslaved Hebrews were probably working on were fortresses and other fortifications along the boundaries of the country, and also on domestic projects such as canal building and building for storage of grains and so on. So it was more of a infrastructure type of building. It wasn't the building of the pyramids at all. In Exodus, we also learned the word theophany. A visible manifestation of God is what theophany means. In Exodus, a major change is that God is no longer up above the dome of the earth, but that he has descended to be with the people in the new tabernacle, the portable house for the Ark of the Covenant. So God enters the tabernacle and he is then residing with and among the people and travels with them. He becomes visible in the form of a cloud of fire and of smoke. And so he traveled with the people in the wilderness. So now we have this manifestation of God in a visible form. The main character of Exodus is Moses. Moses' purpose is to re-educate the people into a covenant community, and that was his mission. He was to prepare a new generation of faithful people to carry on the blessings promised to the patriarchal fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. In Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments are revealed to Moses. They are also called the Decalogue, and they become the center of the new covenant of the Israelite community. So now the new covenant is basically living according to the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. There are 3 plots within the story of Exodus. First, there's the continuation of the covenant through the law, new laws given. There's the struggle between Pharaoh and God, which is symbolic for the people. Who will you owe your allegiance to? Will you owe your allegiance to an earthly ruler or to God himself, to Yahweh? And can Israel belong to Yahweh? Can Israel follow in God's ways, learn God's ways, and belong to him as a group of people? So those are the main plots within the book of Exodus. And the journey through the wilderness is a way of finding and building the relationship with God. Israel is to become a holy nation and a priestly nation. To be holy means to be set apart for God, to have your purpose in God. Exodus 19 will give more details on that. And To the Jewish community, Moses is regarded as the greatest prophet of all time. The Exodus event is a pivotal event in Jewish history. Many traditional practices can be traced back to remembering that event that sent Israel on a course toward becoming its own nation. Some of those practices include, what is it called? Passover. And then there's also the Feast of Tents, which is symbolic of the traveling of the nation through, or the people through the desert when they are living in tents, and the Passover, which is the night in which the Jewish people put the blood of lamb on top of their door lintels and window lintels so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. And here's another joke that I didn't use last fall, but I still think is kind of cool. Poor Moses, he really needed a GPS system of some sort. It says, I won't worry about a poor sense of direction unless maybe you were in some sort of unlikely situation like wandering the desert with a large group of people who depended on you to get them somewhere, says the psychologist or therapist. Poor Moses. In the book of Leviticus, we looked at it as a book of law that is the interpretation of the laws, and it is a guide for the Levitical priests. It's not really directed to the common people, but rather to the priests, and should be a guide for how they will instruct the people and how they will lead them in worship. So it's really a manual for the religious leaders of Israel. In the mitzvah, there are 613 laws that are based on the interpretation of the original Decalogue, or the original 10 commandments given to Moses. So that's a lot of laws that have been derived from the original 10. And we looked a lot at, in Leviticus, the function of the priests and how they were to be dressed and so on. The high priest has quite the elaborate garments and has a breastplate with a stone in it that represents each tribe of Israel. Jesus summed up all these 613 laws into a short sentence. He says that the laws really mean love God and love your neighbor. The first 4 commandments of the Decalogue focus on your relationship with God, and the last 6 focus on your relationship with your neighbors. You can read Jesus' words in Matthew 22. In the book of Numbers, it translates into the term the wilderness, is what Hebrew or Jewish Bibles calls it, as in the wilderness. Numbers is more than just organizing the people for entry to the promised land. It's once the tribes were organized around this new tabernacle, this moving house of worship, the Spirit of Yahweh entered the center of the camp. Symbolically, now God descended from Mount Sinai and dwells with the people. The first section of Numbers focuses on order and administration. So the camp was set up around the new tabernacle, and around it itself in the center were the tribe of Levi, which became the priests and the guardians of this tabernacle. And then each tribe was assigned to a side of the tabernacle and would move in order when they picked up and decided to travel. The second section of Numbers focused on purity laws, and there was more instruction about the Decalogue. The long transition allowed the older generation to pass on, and the new generation to learn the meaning of being holy or set aside for God. So during the book of Numbers, a lot of time passes by, and the older generation still looked back to Egypt and hadn't quite made a full transition to believing in Yahweh and following in the ways. So the time in the desert is to allow them to live out their natural lives and to have a new generation who's been taught by Moses to prepare them to follow Yahweh and be set apart. And the final section takes place on the plains of Moab and is the preparation for entering Canaan. Here we saw the torch of leadership passed from Moses to Joshua. Moses viewed the promised land from Mount Nebo, but he was not allowed into the promised land. He was part of the elder generation. And he was buried in an unknown place in the land of Moab. And so here's kind of a quick overview of the tribes and how they were assigned by Joshua into different sections. Moses would have been in this area where he was allowed to look across into the valley of the Jordan and probably seeing part of the hilly country. And then somewhere in Moab is where he is. It's traditionally believed that he is buried. Moab is a conflicting entity for Israel, and there'll be a lot of interaction with them in the future as well. In the book of Deuteronomy, when we get there, we feel like maybe we've already read this, and that is because Deuteronomy means second law, and it does go back over much of the law that was taught in the books of Exodus and Numbers previously. So it's preparing the second generation, now that the elder generation has passed on, to become landowners when they enter this new country. And also the book reviews the obligations and blessings promised to those who remain faithful to Yahweh. In Deuteronomy, Moses gave 3 speeches. The first reviews the history and unique relationship between Israel and God. The second speech is a review of the law, and the law is considered to be a great gift to Israel. It's not considered a burden, but it is actually a gift of guidance. And the third speech is Moses's personal farewell speech. So altogether, these books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books in our Old Testament are called the Pentateuch. Penta means 5. And traditionally, they are ascribed to Moses, but they were instead most likely compiled much later by groups of scribes working to create a unified written story of Israel's history, probably during the time known as the exile. In Joshua, we saw leadership to be transferred from Moses to Joshua. The earlier leadership was for instruction, and this new leadership under Joshua is for construction. That is, it is to build a new nation beginning with tribal land distribution. In the book of Joshua, we have the great conquest stories, such as the sun standing still during the height of a battle and the fall of the walls that surrounded Jericho. In Judges, we learned the word apostasy, which means refusing to follow, obey, or recognize a religious faith. The narrative in the book of Judges tells of the many times Israel fell away from worshiping God. And it was said they were doing evil in the sight of God, which was followed by oppression by some enemy, after which Israel cries out for help. And then a judge is raised up to save the people. So there's a definite pattern in Judges of doing evil, which generally consisted of worshiping other gods from the peoples around them. And then an oppression by an enemy and crying for help, and then sending help in the form of a judge to lead them through this crisis. In Judges, we learned about famous heroes of the Old Testament who committed great feats over their enemies. For example, we learned about a woman judge, Deborah, and we learned about Gideon and Samson, among others. In the book of Ruth, we read and discussed Ruth. We found out that there was a possible different view of this story through the eyes of Naomi, the mother-in-law. Ruth was a Moabite, which is an enemy tribe for Israel. There were several ways to interpret the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. All right, so that's a quick and brief overview of last year. So for thoughts and discussion, I'm wondering, what were some surprising lessons from the teachings we had so far? And what were some of your favorite characters or stories, and why? What provokes you to think deeper about God of the Old Testament? And what pattern did you see throughout those books? So some foods for thought there. In summary, we learned that the early books are called the Deuteronomic history and are believed to have been assembled from ancient accounts into an organized set of stories by scribes during and following the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, which took place between 620 and 536 BCE. So many years following the events of the stories. They were compiled through oral history and various stories that had been around with the different tribes and compiled into an organized book. So they would have been on maybe small scrolls like this, stories, different stories, and then put together. My suggested reading for this week is 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2, in which you get a picture of family life and also a picture of redemption within the family. Pay particular attention to Hannah's poem of praise in chapter 2. And finally, we'll close with a verse of the day from 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. Keep alert, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, that all that you do be done in love. Kind of like the interpretation from Exodus and Numbers. To be courageous, be strong, stay set apart and firm in faith. And our voice is from Brother Lawrence. He says, we ought not be weary of doing little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of work, but the love with which it is performed. And it is not necessary to have great things to do. I turn my little omelet in the pan for the love of God. In our prayer for today, may we remember that we cannot do great things with great love without first doing little things with great love. And with that, I wish you a good week. Come back and we'll start our study of Samuel next week.